Thank you, Whitney, and thank you, Aaron. I'm not sure any of us can compete with Christopher's own words, as quoted by Aaron. In fact, I think you should publish those diaries, actually. I think they would be fantastic. In any case, speaking of Christopher's words, I hope all of you have had the chance, before we began the program, to enjoy the incredible slide loop that was running behind this curtain, a loop of words as much as images, bringing some of Christopher's best columns back in front of us. We all know that Christopher Gray was a remarkable, extraordinary, one-of-a-kind, eccentric, kind, knowing, and brilliant. What we want to do in the next hour or so is delve behind those adjectives and talk for a while about his influence on the field that he loved so much. Or perhaps I should say on the two things that he loved so much, architectural history and New York City, and how he forged a unique intersection between those two with the Office for Metropolitan History, his research business, and with his journalism, most famous, of course, in the immortal Streetscapes columns. I don't think anybody, including the very distinguished present company, has done quite so much to connect architecture to the rest of life, to show New Yorkers who love their city how much its great buildings contribute to the love that they have and often don't know how to express. I think what Christopher Gray did was teach people how to express that love. He taught them what it means, where it came from, and how great buildings are not just physical artifacts, but social, cultural, political, and economic events. He saw architecture as all of these things, as part of the physical city and as part of the social and cultural and financial city, and maybe most of all as part of the emotional city. He made that emotional city deeper and more meaningful for all of us. And I think that's a lot of what brought us all here tonight and what we'll be talking about over the next few minutes. You know, as I was thinking about Christopher, I remembered how Lewis Mumford, who, like Christopher, grew up in a single-parent household without a father present, Mumford once wrote about how the city itself was like a parent to him, his guide to the greater, broader world, the lens through which he saw and felt his own potential. And I wondered if we could, in fact, almost say the same about Christopher Gray, that the city was a kind of parent for him, nurturing him as he explored it, and that he then felt so compelled, as Mumford did, to share it with the world as he took his own place in it. So let's begin, if we can, sort of taking off from that, and if I can ask all of you to comment, each in your own way, and just what Christopher's sensibility was. You know, how would you define how he looked at buildings and architecture?
Well, one thing that I noticed right away, is this loud enough?
No, okay.
Is it on? Well, technology, I hate
Right.
technology, sorry. How was that?
No. Here, borrow mine.
Okay.
Thank you.
We can, yeah. Thank you. What was amazing about Christopher was putting everything in a socio-cultural and political and economic context. So it wasn't just in these streetscapes, it wasn't just giving you the history of a building, but it was also putting it in something that actually would appeal to a normal reader, meaning not necessarily committed to architecture. And so, for example, when he was writing about the Lewis Comfort Tiffany Mansion, he cited sociocultural histories, such as Charles Decay in Arts and Decoration magazine, writing about Tiffany's home on 72nd and Madison, which was demolished in 1936 for a building where Richard Meyer now lives, and Anthony Ames, among others. However, he also...
Suzanne Stevens is second only to Christopher Gray in her ability to give us interesting footnotes.
So I'll give you a few more. No, but anyway, when everybody was making a big kerfuffle about the tearing down of Williams Chen Folk Art Museum by the Museum of Modern Art on East 53rd Street, Christopher Gray reminded everybody that the Museum of Modern Art had been tearing down buildings on 53rd Street for a long time. And it wasn't just the Rockefeller houses. He cited the Blumenthal and Barber houses. And then when everybody was carrying on about Penn Station, you know, starting off the Landmarks Preservation Commission, in a sense, giving it a push, he said, well, there was George Post Produce Exchange, which was demolished at Lower Broadway in 1957. And nobody carried on about that, but that was considered one of the best examples of architecture, certainly by George Post in this city. And George Post today is forgotten because, unlike McKim, Mead & White, there are not so many George Post buildings left. And he was generous. He cited Nathan Silver, who'd come out with Lost New York in 1967, and said that Nathan brought up the fact that this was one of the best of Post buildings and should have been saved. So Chris Gray was, in a sense, saying, preservationists, where were you then?
Okay. Francis? Yeah.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah. Okay.
You can hear me, and I presume you can see me. I have a light right in my eye, and you're totally invisible to me. Christopher, I think, was notable as a writer about architecture because he always sought the human element in architecture and in buildings. And in that respect, I think it's very interesting that his career as a researcher and writer, like my own, really covered a very interesting period for people who do research professionally, because he started out before there was an internet. In the 1980s, Christopher was writing columns that were very much like the columns that he would continue to write after certain kinds of research became much, much easier to do. And of those kinds of research, there is preeminently research in newspaper archives. Christopher was about halfway through his career when newspaper, sort of the boom in the digitization of newspaper archives took place, which, if you don't use these very often, you may not realize what an amazing thing this was for researchers. It made newspapers became full text searchable. And previously, they had only been searchable via keyword indexes, if that. So it meant you could now find out stuff about buildings, details about buildings, information that was in classified ads, for example, that you could literally never before find. And what this did was it set off a great boom in interest among all researchers for finding the human stories buried in buildings. And yet, that's something that Christopher had been doing all along. He'd been doing it the hard way all along. It wasn't only until it became relatively easy to do that that everybody else followed suit. But if you read stuff that Christopher wrote in 1985, it's like the stuff that people are writing today. It was way ahead of its time in that respect. And also the ways in which he sought the human element in architecture. It wasn't only learning about the people who lived in buildings. You know, Christopher was really dedicated to research and census data and finding out who lived in this building and what their occupations were and who replaced the people who originally lived in these buildings and so on. But he also was interested in the human element in the building of the building.
Right.
People might be surprised, for instance, that he once said that he found Frank Gehry to be a really interesting architect, because even though Gehry's buildings were designed with the aid of computers, there was so much hand work that went into the making of those buildings that the craftsmen working on them were really crafting them bit by hand, and that to him was the really, really interesting thing about Frank Gehry buildings. So it's the human...
Which not enough other people saw, but he did.
Right, yes, exactly, because that was what he was always looking for. And it had an amazing impact on some of us, on me particularly. You know, I've said before that Christopher was an idol of mine, if not my idol. And that was it more than anything else, was, you know, just sort of that seeking after the human element and knowing that because of that, there's no such thing as a truly nondescript building.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful line we should all remember. Mike, how would you describe his sensibility?
Idiosyncratic, among other things. It was very interesting to hear Aaron read from the Russian travel diary, because you could hear it there. I mean, he had an eye for things. He had a wonderful wit about him. Both the eyes and the wit sharpened over time. And so when it eventually became my lot to work with him, they were plenty sharp. It was just a continuing joy. I'd just like to add a couple of bits of background on the actual production, if you will, of the column. As we heard earlier, Streetscapes first appeared in 1987 and ran to the end of 2014. That's 1,000, or a little bit less than 1,400 columns, which is just an amazing run. And aren't we all grateful? The format never really changed. There always had to be some sort of peg for the column, a reason why it was running now rather than 3 years ago or 6 months ago. It might be a restoration completed or beginning, the raising of an adjacent building exposing a clearer view, consideration by landmark societies, whatever. The columns were frequently utterly fascinating stories of people who left their marks on the world around us. Christopher was really a storyteller. Architects celebrated and little known, Edith Wharton's 2 elderly real estate developer aunts. Below stairs memories, this is my favorite, I have to say. Below stairs memories of the 4th footman, who began his working life in a family's Newport and Manhattan mansions, supervised by a tyrannical butler who emphasized his insignificance by giving him the 4th footman title, although there were actually 3 footmen in the household. The footman later joined the Navy and eventually retired from a teaching career at St. Bernard School after 3 decades. What was the peg for that particular column? The new season of Downton Abbey.
Right. I mean, Christopher could really connect absolutely everything to the architectural history of New York, I think. Mike, let's stay on Streetscapes for a moment. Did he select all the columns, or did you as an editor ever suggest all the topics, I mean, for columns?
He really selected them. He was very patient with occasional suggestions.
Which he smiled graciously at and then ignored, or did he?
You could hear it over the phone. That might be interesting. Something like that.
Which was Christopher Gray for Not a Chance, right?
Or something.
Right,
no,
right.
It was really by the time I came to this, it was really a pattern. The columns would appear like clockwork with wonderful photographs to illustrate them. It was frequently a challenge for us to go out and take and here's what it looks like today photograph for one reason or another, but that's why we had great photographers. Occasionally I'd get a call from Christopher bouncing a few ideas off me to see what I might have thought of. He was also, it should be mentioned, because he had the Office of Metropolitan History, he was very, very careful that work that was done for clients of the Office of Metropolitan History not be seen in any way to influence what he was writing about. So every once in a while, I'd get a call from him that would go something like, you know, I've got an idea for what I think would be an interesting streetscapes about a building. Now, 8 years ago, when they were doing a refurbishment, they asked me to find a blueprint. Do you think that would be a conflict? As I say, he was extremely sensitive about that, and I very much appreciated that.
Boy, are those ethics from another age? Actually.
One question I
Yes.
have is, you know, when the column ended in 2014, those of us in the architecture community were just devastated, absolutely devastated, and still are. Why did the Times stop the column, and why haven't they tried to replace the irreplaceable Christopher Gray with somebody else to write it?
Well, I guess the first thing I should say is I was retired by then, so I don't know.
Not enough.
You are Mike, you are blameless, so you can answer the question.
That answers the first part of your question. The second part of the question, I think you've answered yourself by using the term irreplaceable.
But you could try. I mean, the Times has to replace its critics. Architecture critics, art critics, every so often, book critics, they find replacements. You know, architecture is still a large field, no matter what you think.
Well, you know, it's true, but this was a very different sort of column. I mean, newspapers have to have, you know, an art critic, or a newspaper like the Times has to have an art critic and a dance critic and an architecture critic. It's non-negotiable. Whereas this was a very individual column of a sort that nobody else ever really did. You know, I wrote a column once which was superficially similar to it, but really wasn't anything like it at all. And it was Christopher's idea. You know, I don't think the Times came to him with the idea. I could be wrong. I have no idea how the column began. But I'm just presuming that it was, you know, Christopher's baby from the beginning. It was born with him, and it, you know, died with him.
Yeah.
I can actually add a little bit to that.
Okay.
I reread, before coming over here today, the wonderful David Dunlap's wonderful obituary of Christopher.
Yes.
Which answered the question, where did this column come from? And the answer was that Christopher had, and Aaron, you can correct me on this if I'm remembering it incorrectly, Christopher had done a similar column for Avenues magazine.
Right, yes.
And then that ran a couple of years, and then Better Homes and Gardens?
Or House and Garden.
House and Garden.
In
House and Garden.
1983, I think.
Ah, okay.
Ran it for a couple of years. And then it went fallow, and then my predecessor in the real estate section, Mike Stern, asked Christopher to do it for us. Blessings to Mike. And here's a footnote, and this says something about Christopher. 20 years after the column started, in the memorial notes, the paid obituary things, the memorial notes of the Times, appeared a little note that went something like this. To Michael Stern, who was then dead for 10 years, I think, to Michael Stern, who gave me my column 20 years ago.
I think it's fair to say there is no other writer at the New York Times who would have ever thought as kindly of his editor to do that. I think.
Not even you.
Well, I must say, it didn't occur to me now that I think of it. But, you know, this gets to, and let's stay for one more moment on the column. There are many things in the New York Times that people don't like. There are many things that they admire and are grateful for. there are relatively few features in the New York Times that you might describe as beloved. But this was, in fact, beloved by readers. And that is quite extraordinary. And to go back to what I think both Francis and Mike have been saying, you know, yes, it could be done by somebody else, but whether it would have those qualities and evoke that degree of emotional response from other people is uncertain.
Well, I think that's true, and part of it goes to I think this is probably the third time I've used this word, but Christopher was a wonderful, wonderful storyteller, and he had this idiosyncratic approach to things, and he would do just terrific research. We are very finicky editors, or we were very finicky editors.
Yeah.
Rarely did we ever find anything that was amiss, even slightly, in what Christopher had reported. And when we did, he was just, struck.
You're saying because the
this thought.
Times doesn't fact check, doesn't have a separate department of fact checkers. For example, they depend a lot on the writer, the reporter, the critic to do the fact checking.
The only department at the Times that has fact checkers is the magazine. What we do have, or did have in my day at the Times, were truly excellent copy editors.
Yes. Who were quasi-fact checkers, in effect.
Yes,
Yes, they were de facto fact checkers, we might
Right.
say. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
a good copy editor is a wonderful, wonderful person to have on your side. And then there are other layers of editing as well. But the copy editors really were just superb.
And if I could just
Yeah, please
amplify
do.
something that
Please
Mike
jump in.
said about Christopher, the researcher, and that is speaking as the one among us here who is a professional researcher. He represented a real gold standard in architectural research in New York City. Truly, I don't think anybody ever came close to
Right.
him. He was just meticulous and scrupulous in his research. Over the years, I kept a little notebook in which I noted down every mistake he made that I recognized, and I think there were maybe 4. And that was in 1,400 columns of his that I read. But, he was almost obsessive about the research. I mean, almost like autistically obsessive about the research. And as a result, he was very demanding of others.
Yes.
And very critical of others whose own research didn't measure up. Just a couple of quick things. For starters, he was not keen on many of the leading academics in the field. He felt that a lot of academics sort of skated by with very meager research. A lot of academics who wrote about New York architecture, he felt didn't even really know how to research a New York building.
Right.
And he wasn't shy about saying this and naming names. I won't name names, but one of the things, if you knew Christopher and you knew sort of how he spoke and the cadences of his speech, you would mention so-and-so, who wrote a book that's used in all the departments of architectural history, and he would look at you and say, if you must. So he was very skeptical of academics, and in general, he was very demanding when he read anything by anybody that did New York architectural research. And of course, this goes to the reports of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. He had very high regard for the research abilities of a lot of the people who work at the Landmarks Preservation Commission, but he also would say that he sort of missed the old style, much less legalistic style of Landmarks Commission reports that he said were written by individuals who were very broadly cultured. And this was also something that he prized in architectural writing. Why he admired Henry Hope Reed.
Yeah. Well, he had what seemed to me to be an absolutely profound and insatiable curiosity about almost everything, and which architecture was first and foremost. But architecture's connections to everything else were always critical to him, and I think that, and you know, to me, what was always so remarkable was that combination of awesomely focused, meticulous research, as you've just told us, and the ability to translate that into telling very human stories. In other words, you know, his research was extraordinary, but it never turned out in the end to yield a product that was just a bunch of data. It was always woven into a beautiful tapestry of a story.
You know, he mentioned, though, that each article had a modest research budget of 20 to 24 hours just for research. And, you know, this brings up economics, you know, the question of research economics and how you live and how you support a family, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how you do it on the, you know, the Times column. Or I would understand House and Garden would be a little bit better, because in those days Condé Nast was a little bit
was more generous, yes.
But
at least they would send you in a taxi cab, if nothing else, right.
So it's, but it does bring up this question of just the output, the sheer output, and then trying to make a living out of it. Francis, maybe you could address this a little bit, because do you come in?
Aaron could probably address it much better than I.
But as another.
Yes.
Let's follow that a little bit. I mean, on one level, of course, running a business as an architectural historian is a slightly crazy, mad thing to do, right? I mean, it's definitely not a hedge fund. I mean, it's sort of not. It is certainly not something that one imagines vast pots of gold coming out of.
Yeah, I discovered that recently.
Right.
It's, but you know, I think that the people who do this, I think this was probably true of Christopher, as it is true of me, do it because they can't do anything else. You know, they're not really motivated to do anything else. It's love, and you know, you do what you can. I mean, I know that in my case, I work 7 days a week, 365 days a year, but I justify it by saying that I'm doing what I would be doing anyway if I didn't work.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
getting paid at least a little bit for it, if not a lot. Right.
At least a little bit. Well, you know, the little bits add up, and you know, my wife makes a lot of money. So anyway, the
a hedge funder, no doubt.
but yeah, no, it's a difficult thing to do. But that leads into another question, which is that, and this was something that Christopher, I know, thought about and spoke about to me, and that is with the boom in blogs. There are a lot of sort of vaguely streetscapes-y sorts of websites out there.
Like Herb.
Well, no, I don't mean like Herb.
Is different, I think. Herb is
like Daytonian in Manhattan. These ones which do.
I don't even know that one.
buildings.
Okay.
Here's a guy who really writes about a fairly decently researched piece about a New York Manhattan building every single day.
Wow.
And it's a time-consuming thing. Obviously, it's time-consuming, but he or many others who write on the internet rely upon the internet for almost all of their research. Now, Christopher, I know, believed strongly that the internet will only give you 80% of the story, and the other 20% isn't on the internet. A lot of New York City building records aren't on the internet. You have to actually go downtown and sift through the physical records yourself in order to find just dates and names of architects and so on. People don't realize this, but he would, he felt that these blogs gave people sort of like 70 to 80% of what he was able to give them through the research that he did, and he worried a little bit, I think, or maybe I was just projecting onto him that this was good enough for most people. But it wasn't Christopher Gray.
Right.
It wasn't written like Christopher Gray. It wasn't researched as well as Christopher Gray. It did not have the sensibility, but was it good enough for most readers?
Which of course is analogous to a far broader problem in journalism in our culture today.
Yes,
which this embodies, but in fact we're seeing this in almost every field across all of journalism, really. That, because of course internet research, not only is it, as Christopher said to you, 80% of what he might have done through other means, but the greater problem, in a way, is of that 80%, it may only be 70% accurate. So, and whereas Christopher was, unimpeachable. And I remember when I wrote my first book, a book that was an architectural guide to Manhattan called The City Observed, Christopher helped with the research. And I hadn't the foggiest notion how to navigate the buildings department, actually. And because of Christopher, I never had to learn, actually. He just sort of did it. And every time I would go out and walk the streets and take notes, and I would come back and say, I saw the most extraordinary row of row houses on 78th Street, and they're not like anything else I've ever seen. And Christopher would immediately say, Guastavino. And then he would say, and I'll just check tomorrow, and I'll get you the exact dates and all that. And tomorrow he would show up with precisely the dates and everything else I needed to know.
Well, that just reminds me. I once ran into Henry Hope Reed on the street, and I was on my way to the Department of Buildings, and I told him that, and he just looked at me and said, "Why don't you let Christopher Gray do it?"
The only person who could navigate his way around. I would run into him in the microfiche room at the New York Public Library, and also remember the New York Times Annex? This is all pre-digital, when you had to go through archives. And he knew how to thread a microfilm, when of course I didn't. So I was saying, oh my gosh, what he does. It's incredible. It was incredible.
No, it really was, yes.
It might also be mentioned that the Office of Metropolitan History contained some dusty volumes that had stuff that I gather can't be found anywhere else. And Christopher occasionally would make a find of some obscure book from somewhere, and he was very happy to talk about this because it was really the only place that you can find such and such and such and such.
There was such consistent joy, too, to the way he approached all of it, as well as an ability to kind of puncture pretense where it intersected with the world of architecture, too. I remember when the Office for Metropolitan History first set up on the West Side, back in the days when that building at 80th and Broadway had H&H Bagels downstairs. And Christopher said, yes, I have a new office, and it's at number 1 H&H Bagel Plaza. Only Christopher would have thought to say number 1 H&H Bagel Plaza, which instantly in that one phrase encompassed sort of a kind of love and beautiful, teasing of New York in both its best and worst.
Along with that, and in line with puncturing egos and so forth, generally when I would have reason to call Christopher, he would pick up the phone and say some variation on, "Oh, glorious editor, my day is made."
Right. No, absolutely. Let me ask each of you, and if you recall specific columns in a particular way beyond, as real favorites or ones that you cherish. I know that Mike's already referred to. I guess you've each referred to some. Are there any others that changed your way of thinking, or that?
I'll just give
Yeah,
an example
sure.
of why I don't read the New York Times online and why you have to read it, page by page, because you would open up in the good old days, you'd open up the real estate section and you would turn and you'd find an article on the Dakota and you'd say, okay, I already know what the Dakota history is. Oh, I see. Edward Clark came along and decided he was going to change a whole neighborhood, and then he started buying land, and then he had to go to Paris and figure out the courtyard scheme, and then he had to hire Henry Hardenberg to design it, and then he built these huge apartments that had 4 bathrooms, and then put up the servants' quarters on the roof, so that amazingly this ill-begotten section of town in the 1880s, so far north they called it, or west or whatever, they called it the Dakota, became a posh place to live in. And then so much so that somebody like Ward Bennett, who became a very well-known designer in the 60s and 70s, took a whole bunch of maids' rooms and made them servants' rooms and made them into an apartment that was extremely. So you're saying, this is why I read this column, because I find out all these things. I added the Ward Bennett part, but you find out all these things leading up to what you can bring to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Francis?
There are lots of columns of Christopher's that resonate with me, columns about individual buildings. Someone told me recently that Christopher told her that Martin Filler knew Christopher's columns better than Christopher did. And I sometimes think I'm in that category, because I was always mentioning things to Christopher that he forgot, or he would chide me about something that I got from one of his columns. And then he would have completely forgotten, or at least pretended that he'd completely forgotten. But there were, in recent years, there was a kind of column that he would write that was more personal.
Mm-hmm.
There was one about, his bachelor days,
Right.
in which, he talked about working as a cab driver, and he talked about, the things that he made for himself for dinner, and how he sort of described the dawning of his interest in historic New York architecture, and I thought it was just a marvelous piece. It included material in it that, he researched, so there was history, but there was also autobiography in it. And another column that he wrote was about what he called vanished signposts from his youth, things that meant something to him, sort of landmarks that meant something to him, like that weird thing at Alexander's department store with the, what do you call it, the sort of like bosoms.
Well, right.
I was trying to think of the right word.
Merely mentioning Alexander's department store already dates it a certain amount, right?
But if I may just say one more thing, and that is, and it's because I recently looked it up. Some years ago, 2007, it was Architecture Week, and Leonard Lopate had Christopher on his show. Brian Lehrer had me on his show, so that shows you who had the upper hand at that time. Anyway, I listened to Christopher on Leonard Lopate. The whole idea was a call-in segment. People would call in and talk about buildings and what was great about it was Christopher, the spoken Christopher, was a lot more unbuttoned than the written Christopher. There was also the tone. There was sometimes the excitement or mock excitement in the things that he said that didn't come across initially when you read him, but once you'd heard him speak, then you got that from the writing.
Yes, I think that's a very, very subtle and very perceptive point, actually. That the writing is more emotive when you knew him than it might appear to be.
Yes,
right,
exactly. Right. And on this segment, he was something that he almost was above all else for me, and that was a really spirited contrarian. One of those people, and I get it, who just likes to disagree with you. Whatever you say, he'll say the opposite, and he does it for a reason. It gets to get people thinking and to get conversation going. I think this was important to him. I think he thought there was, just like there was a lot of sloppy research, there was a lot of sloppy thinking. Goodness knows, he hated phrases that nobody could used all the time and couldn't define. He used to say, "What does human scale mean? What does affordable housing mean?" Nobody could sort of define these to his satisfaction. But on this Leonard Lopate show, somebody called in and started talking about how horrible it was that there was this building on Norfolk Street by Bernard Tschumi called Blue, this big blue glass apartment building, and it just sapped all the character out of the neighborhood. It was a neighborhood that once, had a real New York spirit to it. Now it's been destroyed. And there was a moment of silence after she spoke, and Christopher said, "I love that building." He said, "I think what that neighborhood needed was a big blue building." and he said, "There's just, that neighborhood was so drab," and it just, so he could really be like that. And you're sitting there thinking, does he really think this? But
you can just hear him saying it, though.
Yes,
you can just absolutely hear him saying it. That's wonderful. And of course, in some ways, one could argue that building, for better or for worse, represents a truer New York spirit of this moment than what was still there. You talk about it being a contrarian. Can we talk for a moment before we need to adjourn fairly soon about his relationship to the preservation movement, which I know is sometimes more complex than it might be thought to have been from outside?
Well, that when Christopher retired from Streetscapes, there was a lot of recognition of the work that Christopher did. A lot of preservation organizations honored him and so forth. And preservation organizations that are run by, nowadays, young preservationists who weren't around back in the day when Christopher sometimes was not the favorite of the preservation community. He was not, throughout his career, what you would call, in any way, shape, or form, a program preservationist, somebody who, or a knee-jerk preservationist, or what was the phrase you used?
I said preservation fundamentalist. Is the phrase
and I know that he would often, make fun of some of the things that people were trying to get designated as landmarks. I don't think that he ever thought that there should be no landmarks law, but I think that he thought sometimes it went a little far. And he, I know, talked about being at landmarks hearings where he would sit next to, he talked about sitting next to an eminent architectural historian, and I know who it was, but I'm not going to say, who leaned over to Christopher as somebody was making a presentation about some building and said to him, "That building is just awful." And Christopher agreed. And then Christopher said, "So you're not going to support designation?" And this eminent architectural historian said, "Oh, of course I'm going to support designation." And Christopher was aghast. Why would you support the designation of something that you thought was awful? And he thought for himself when it came to preservation. He could not be sort of corralled into the preservation controversy du jour. Although that said, he had enormous respect for preservationists who really put in the work.
Yes, yes.
As opposed to armchair preservationists who would say, "Why isn't such and such designated?" He would say, "If you want it designated, then go out there and work for its designation." He had nothing but admiration for Christabel Goff, for instance. People like that who were at the commission every day, working there.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Good. Great. We're almost at our adjournment time, but the subject is so rich and there's so much to say. We'd love to bring you into the discussion for a few minutes before we move upstairs. If there's some questions or comments preferably questions rather than comments. But Peter, hi. Actually, if you wait a moment, there will be a microphone magically appearing.
This is not so much a question, but Christopher, unfortunately, for many years until I learned more, I called him Chris, but he didn't like that. But Christopher worked in our office in the 1970s. It was Grusin and Partners, later became Grusin Sampton, and we were working then on the changing the old Commodore Hotel to the Grand Hyatt.
Oh, we know where this is going.
And we were forced because Donald Trump was the client, and we were forced because this is what he wanted, to sheathe it in glass. He actually wanted a glass building, but we talked him into keeping the masonry because from an energy point of view, it would have been a lot better.
Right.
And so glass was the solution to go over the old Commodore. And then he and I spoke about the possibility of making, instead of that mirror glass, which is what Trump wanted, to make it see-through glass. So you would see the facade of the old Commodore Hotel. It's sort of like thinking about it as pheasant under glass. You would see it that way, but of course that never happened. But we had a lot of difficulty then, but Christopher was always a bit of a ray of light when we came to looking about preservation, even in this case, which was not really preservation.
Right. And was he an advocate of that alternative plan to have clear glass? In other words, Christopher.
Yeah, he was, but Trump never wanted it.
Somehow the notion of Christopher Gray and Donald Trump in the same universe is a difficult thing to comprehend.
Excuse me, but on that same Leonard Lopez show, somebody was talking about the vulgarity of Donald Trump, and Christopher, ever the contrarian, said, "I don't know why people have this thing about Donald Trump. He really hasn't done anything that's that awful." This was 2007. Okay.
Right, exactly. He was, right. Let that rest. Okay. Any others? Yes, couple back here. The lady in the back, and then you, sir. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Spellin, and I used to write for brownstoner.com. And Christopher started writing comments on my columns. I did a very similar kind of column, historical and architectural historian kind of stuff. And I got to know him as a commenter because he would comment with the most, annoying and silly comments where he would say, "Oh, you wrote about so-and-so. They were such a third-rate architect." And my whole focus was Brooklyn, and he used to come to Brooklyn once in a while to find something to write about. And one day he emailed me and he said, "You can't go to Decatur Street. You can't write about Decatur Street." And Decatur Street is a huge, long block. And I said, "Well, you don't own Brooklyn." And he said, "I'll be there. You wait." And and so I had just happened to write a story about Decatur Street. And he said, "You didn't see me. There were a lot of Middle Eastern people in that neighborhood." And he said, "I was in a burqa." And you... And just the thought of him, 6'4", as waspy as you can get in a burqa, is my favorite memory of him.
Thank you. That's wonderful, sir. Yes, please. Oh, here comes the mic.
My question is very short. Would one of you or two of you describe what Christopher Gray's office was like?
Francis probably is the one, because I was actually never in it, in fact, even though we were often in touch.
Well,
I was never invited to one
I guess I'm the
H&H
one
Bagel
person here
Plaza.
who was in his office, crammed, full of boxes, very dusty and musty, and I'm not sure it could have been too healthy to spend, like a long period of time in there. Also, one did get the impression that, when you go to the Department of Buildings or the Municipal Archives, sometimes they don't have what you're looking for. It's just not there. It's gone. And I had the feeling it was in Christopher's office. Because it just had so many oddments, including, by the way, books that I sold to him, because I was a bookseller, and that's how I met him.
Oh, really?
Many
Wow.
years ago.
Wow.
And but yeah, it was really. And then there was, as I remember, there was a desk. I remember Suzanne Braley sitting at that desk with a computer in front of her, and it was just sort of like this little pool of light in the middle of everything. It had a faintly dungeon-like atmosphere too.
I can sort of imagine it being almost Dickensian, sort of in its piles of papers and things. But yes, sir. Can we? There's a mic. Thank you. Good.
I can add a little bit to.
Can you hold the mic closer?
I can add a little bit to what to the answer of what was his office like. His office was a very, very good. Is this on? All right. Is this better? Yes. His office was a very, very good reflection of Christopher. It was Dickensian. He had, as an excellent researcher, he had row after row of filing cabinets that he called his topographical files. He had file folders filled with information on buildings, on neighborhoods, on streets. Those file cabinets were an incredible research tool. But beyond that, there were very strange things in that office that reflected Christopher. He had a very large industrial strength refrigerator. In that refrigerator were rolls of nitrate film, negatives, with photographs of New York City that the New York Public Library discarded because they transferred this highly flammable nitrate film onto a second generation of film that was safety film. And they were ready to throw it out. And Christopher said, that's crazy. You can't throw out all these wonderful photographs of the city. And they said, we'll give it to you, but you'll have to provide perpetual refrigeration for it. And Christopher went out and bought a very serious, very large refrigerator for that. Beyond that, when he discovered Gaetano Aiello, who he researched and discovered was the architect of the building that he was living in.
It was the Cornwall on 90th, I think.
No,
But
not the
that
Cornwall.
was-
This was before
That's
the
right,
Cornwall.
right, that's right.
When
It was-
he was
right.
on West End Avenue.
Yes, sorry.
Living with various, I think 3 or 4 of his friends in a 4-bedroom apartment. And he researched the building, and he discovered that Gaetano Aiello had designed it. And then he did further research to try and find out about this architect who had stopped designing buildings in the 1930s. He discovered the man was still alive at 93 or 94, and he was given by the man's sister various files and a rendering, and he mounted that on the wall. He then put up on the wall or the ceiling model airplanes that he had built. He put a very early suit with short trousers and a jacket that Peter wore to his 4th birthday party that I attended in a small restaurant on Lexington Avenue on 81st Street. He had all of this personal stuff there, along with archival stuff and all kinds of quirky things. And that was the kind of person that Christopher was.
Right. No, I think that's wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm glad you mentioned Aiello. I remember his Aiello obsession. He really, I think, felt, and he was indeed a very good architect who Christopher rescued from obscurity. I was actually at the same time in the process of discovering Rosario Candela, and I remember we used to sort of argue over who was the better discovery. But I never had a sort of diorama of anything like that. He was amazing, and I think I recall that when Aiello died, Christopher was just, beside himself with sadness. I mean, he had really become deeply attached to him. I think it's time for us to adjourn to more casual conversation upstairs. Please join me in thanking first Erin and her family for being here and the panel. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.